Today I'm planning to talk about using negative mental states for our benefit. So, I talk quite a bit about how the practice brings joy and happiness. And, we see people pick up the training, pick up the practice, and their life improves and they become less stressed. And, all of those things are true. But what if that's not how you feel? And I think it's probably the case that most of us don't feel that way all the time. And for some people, even people we read about in the suttas, it can be a long time before there's that kind of joy and happiness coming up. Sometimes people learn about the Dhamma, and instead of feeling more free, they might feel afraid or worried. Sometimes people can feel discouraged, sometimes isolated because they're changing, their life is changing, they're changing the way they're living, and not in, what do I want to say, not in sync with the people in their life anymore. All of these kinds of things can happen because going against the stream of the world is sometimes uncomfortable. And so I wanted to talk about what do we do with that. And of course, you probably already know that the first thing is to turn towards it. But that can be hard to remember that we should really embrace it in a way, like instead of trying to push that away or think, oh, I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't feel this way at this point in my practice, or I really don't want to feel this way, trying to get rid of it. So whenever we do that, we make things worse, at least almost always. And instead, to be able to turn towards it and see it. It can be hard to pull ourselves out of feeling down or any of these other challenging mental states, establish enough mindfulness to be able to, really observe what's happening. But we want to train ourselves so that whatever we're feeling, that's what we do. We establish our mindfulness of that feeling and hold it in a way as objective to ourselves so that we can work with it. Now, the truth is that uncomfortable mental states can actually be a tremendous benefit as we practice because of what we do with them. And this is true of life circumstances. When we are challenged, that's when we really have the opportunity to bring to bear those things that we've been practicing and learning, and we can grow, develop, gain insight. And sometimes our teachers evoke or provoke those negative mental states in us for the purpose of showing us how we can not just rise above them or overcome them, but use them on the path of awakening. So I want to share a couple of stories from the suttas. And the first one, I know I talk about this person. I have talked about this person at various times, so I'm not sure if you've all heard about the story of Channa. Now, there are a number of Channas in the suttas, so I think it's like a name like Bill or something, or John, I don't know. But Channa, this Channa, is the one that the Buddha referred to. Excuse me. Is the one that the Buddha referred to when he was on his deathbed. He, one of the last things the Buddha said was that Channa should be given the prime punishment. And Venerable Ananda, even though he was with the Buddha so much, he didn't know what the prime punishment was. He said, what's the prime punishment? And the Buddha said, Channa can say whatever he likes, but the other mendicants should not advise or instruct him. So we learn from a separate discourse, Sutta number 2290 in the Samyutta Nikaya, the linked discourses, what the result was of this prime punishment for Channa. He became really uncomfortable. And it's apparent that Channa must have been a pretty grumpy guy. The footnote to this sutta by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi says, he was obviously angry and unpleasant with his brother monks. And even though he was quite senior, he was a very unpleasant guy to, Bhikkhu Bodhi didn't say all of that, but you kind of get the picture of, a really kind of cantankerous person and basically unavailable for teaching, for training, for listening to what other people were telling him. So the Buddha's like, just don't give him any instruction anymore. And in the sutta, Channa is now going from kuti to kuti, basically from residence to residence, begging the senior monastics to train him, to give him training. So he's pretty miserable. And then the senior mendicants say to him, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness are impermanent. Form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness are not self. All conditions are impermanent. All things are not self. And you might recognize those. Of course, you recognize that idea. And those last two sentences, I think, are incredibly beautiful. They're in our morning chanting that we do every sutta study. All conditioned things, sabbe sankhara, are impermanent, anicca. And all things, all dhammas is the way it is in Pali. All things, including nibbana, are not self. No self in any of it. So very simple teaching. And Channa thinks, I understand that. I think that way too. So I understand that. I get it intellectually, but I'm not getting it at a deep level. So this is a key for what is happening when we're feeling lousy, when we're feeling down, when we're feeling discouraged. If we can pull away from the feeling enough to really be present with it, not in it, and look at what is it that I'm not understanding at a deep level. So I'll say things sometimes like, the more we understand the Dhamma, the happier we become. And so when we're not in that mental space, when we're not really feeling that Dhamma deeply internally, to not add on top of that feeling bad that I'm not, but to see what can I do? What can I do with this? So what Chana decides to do, and I'll just read a little bit here because, I just like the way it's described. He says, I think this way too, and yet my mind isn't eager, confident, settled, and decided about the stilling of all activities, all formations, the letting go of all attachments, the ending of craving, fading away in cessation, nibbana. So I'm not getting it. I'm not getting what, is really there. And he says, anxiety and grasping arise. And the mind reverts to thinking, so then who exactly is myself? But that doesn't happen for someone who sees the teaching, who really understands. And this is mostly the cause of why we have these negative mental states. Somehow the sense of self has the foothold. We're observing from me and mine. And it's like, of course we are. It's not to be down on ourselves, like I said, not add another layer of negative mental states, but to really just recognize this is natural for a human being with all the conditioning that we have. The key to it is to pull away from it enough to see it that way. So to see what Chana was seeing, if those around me who are more awakened, or when other people are coming more from that solid, confident place of the Dhamma, or when I have experienced, you might think there are times, when we feel really settled and supported by the Dhamma, and we feel confident in what we know and what we're feeling, and the wisdom is there. And then he's like, what is happening though, as this anxiety and grasping arise? Who is this self? And that isn't the way I want, like I need to work with this, because we want to, without more negativity towards the mental state, still knowing we're going to move in the direction of that solidity in the Dhamma, that confidence in the Dhamma. So he's saying, that doesn't happen. This kind of grasping and anxiety isn't happening for someone who really understands deeply the teachings. And so his approach is, who can I find who can teach me the Dhamma so that I can see it, so that I can understand it? And he decides to find Venerable Ananda. He has a lot of faith in Ananda, and Ananda has always been kind to him. Now, that's saying something. If you're a cantankerous person and you haven't been so nice to other people, that someone who's always been nice to you, regardless. And that's how he experienced Venerable Ananda. So he actually goes looking for Ananda, and he has to travel some to find him. And when he gets there, he asks Ananda to teach him. And Ananda says, I'm already delighted that you've opened yourself up, and you're getting through, you're getting out, cutting out this emotional barrenness that you've been experiencing. So listen well to me. You're capable of understanding the Dhamma. And right then, Chana's heart is so filled with joy and happiness, because Ananda's got this faith in him. Ananda sees that he can do it. And that lifts him up right away. And then Ananda repeats a teaching that the Buddha gave to a different monk. And I'm not going to go into that right now. I'm sure you'll want to know because Chana actually gets it. And, but I'm going to talk about it on Samish Island in October. So you have to come to the retreat. Or you can read about it in the sutta. But the point being, like, what did Chanda do to work through that barrenness, through that those challenges of negative mental states? And finding someone who we trust to help is one way. Really seeing if we can develop in ourselves kindness and compassion for ourselves. Seeing if we can play Ayya Chittananda's game. Where's the clinging? Where am I seeing this from the self? What am I clinging to? What am I wanting to have be different than it is? Now, these may not be our usual approaches to feeling bad, and we can learn about our own patterns. What do I do when my mental state goes down? And sometimes it works to focus on something that actually brings it up again. It might be kind of a replacing the mental state, but a lot of times that doesn't really do the trick in terms of a longer term kind of real recovery from the tendency for the mind to go that way. I want to share another example with you. This is from the Voice of the Enlightened Monks. This is a translation of the Therigatha by Venerable Kiribati Gyanananda Thera. And I like his translations. And this is the verses of the Arahant Talaputta. So he's an Arahant, but he wasn't an Arahant always, of course. And he's actually the one who appears in the suttas in the section of the linked discourses on like the headman. Oh, thank you, Steve. In that section, this person is actually an actor, and I talked about him a little bit last week when we were talking about was it last week or was it Thursday night? Recently, talking about the power of entertainment and media, but he was an actor. He was a head of an acting troupe, and he came to the Buddha, and the Buddha explained to him, after being pressured quite a bit by Talaputta, to explain that if we're encouraging greed, hatred, and delusion in other people through what we're doing, that's a serious kind of problem. And that's serious for our future. And Talaputta breaks down and cries right there. And he also winds up on the spot asking to become a monk. And then you get a sense of his verses. These are the verses of that he offers after being enlightened. And it's quite long, and it's quite beautifully written, I think. And I kind of think, yeah, you could tell he was he was a performer in a way. So I'm going to read a portion of this. It's like 52 verses, so I'm not going to read all of it, but you could find it in the Therigatha for yourself and check it out later. He says, I'm here really thinking, when indeed shall I go into the thick forest filled with beautiful waterfalls and live there alone with a mind free from craving? When indeed shall I contemplate with insight all existences as impermanent? When indeed shall I fulfill these wishes? Like a sage wearing a torn robe, when shall I wear a robe? When shall I live with my mind free of self-identity and craving? Having removed passion, hatred, and delusion from this mind, when shall I live peacefully in a forest? This is an impermanent body, suffering from various diseases, like a nest disturbed by aging and death. So having penetrated this body with insight and rid of fear, when shall I live alone in the forest? See, I think all of these verses are coming from, I'm not there yet. How do I get there? Craving is the producer of fear, bringer of pain, twining around this entire life. So having taken a sharp sword made of wisdom, when shall I cut the creeper of craving into pieces? When indeed shall I fulfill these wishes? There is a lion throne called serene and insight meditation. There are swords of enlightened ones made of wisdom, of fiery might. So having seated on that lion's throne, holding these swords, when shall I aggressively fight against the army of Mara? When indeed shall I fulfill these wishes? I really like the association of superior people. They respect the Dhamma, have realized the nature of reality, have unshaken minds, and have conquered their senses. When shall I associate with such superior people? When shall I practice the Dhamma very hard with them? I really want to achieve Nibbana, undisturbed by laziness, hunger, thirst, winds, heat, insects, and snakes. When shall I live in a mountain cave? When indeed shall I fulfill this wish? The great seer, the supreme Buddha, realized these four noble truths. So with a still mind, developed wisdom and mindfulness, when shall I realize these four noble truths that are very hard to realize? When indeed shall I fulfill this wish? I really like to develop jhana. So by wisdom, based on one-pointedness of mind, when shall I see these innumerable sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and thoughts as though they were a blazing fire? When indeed shall I fulfill this wish? When shall I live without worrying about people talking harshly to me? When shall I live without being overjoyed when people praise me? When indeed shall I fulfill these wishes? When shall I understand with wisdom these five aggregates of clinging, both internally and externally, as no more than just wood, grass, and creepers? When indeed shall I fulfill this wish? Getting soaked by the rain, when shall I walk on the path walked by the enlightened ones in the forest in the rainy season? When indeed shall I fulfill this wish? In the thick forest among mountains, the peacocks cry out. When shall I wake up to that cry and meditate, wishing for Nibbana? When indeed shall I fulfill this wish? There are great rivers such as the Ganges, Yamuna, and Sarasvati. There are fearful slopes. There are huge lakes. Without touching them with my feet, when shall I cross over these things using my psychic power? When indeed shall I fulfill this wish? Like a king elephant separated from the herd, when shall I meditate, separated from the desire of all the objects that appear to be attractive, connected with sensual pleasures? When indeed shall I fulfill this wish? When shall I live happily, realizing the teaching of the greatest seer, the Buddha, like a poor man stricken by debt, and after being repeatedly oppressed by rich men, has found a golden treasure. When indeed shall I fulfill this wish? Hey, mind, didn't you beg me repeatedly for years to give up the home life? How much did you beg me to become a monk? Now I've become a monk. Hey, mind, why don't you meditate now? Hey, mind, didn't you beg me to go to the forest and meditate sitting on a flat rock in the midst of the mountains where birds cry and waterfalls flow? You told me that you really loved it, didn't you? Hey, mind, it's because of your request that I became a monk, giving up all my possessions and valuables, relatives, friends, enjoyments, and all sorts of sensual pleasures. Now I've entered the forest, but now why don't you make me happy, pushing me on to the path of Nibbana? Hey, mind, this mind doesn't belong to others, it's mine. Now I'm ready for the battle against defilements. But why are you crying now? I have realized that everything is subject to destruction. That's why I renounced the household life, desiring the death-free state, Nibbana. Hey, mind, do you know what the great physician, the best of men, the supreme trainer of people, the speaker of good, the supreme Buddha said about this mind? This mind is very fickle. It's like a monkey always moving in the forest. It's very hard to restrain this mind for one who is not rid of lust. Ordinary people are sunk in ignorance. They attach to these sensual pleasures that are attractive, sweet, and delightful. They seek existence repeatedly and wish only for pain. Taking them away from the good, this mind puts them in hell. The great forest resonates with the cries of peacocks and herons. One is exposed to leopards and tigers. One will have to give up the longing for life. Don't let this opportunity pass you by. Hey, mind, wasn't it you that it urged me to become a monk? That's about half of what he said. But you get the idea. And the way I see that now, when I read it is, all those different ways that we get pulled into the world, or we find it difficult to separate ourselves from it. It's really about working with the mind. And when we find ourselves afraid of taking that step further, we don't have to be in the forest and meditating in caves and all of that, but we can just in our daily life, as we really embrace the Dhamma, we can work with every kind of mental state that arises. And we can really use them for our awakening, for the benefit of ourselves and the benefit of everyone around us. And when we forget that, hopefully we have, we need to develop these habits of reaching out to others who aren't in that same place at that same time and understand the Dhamma. So it's an act of great will, but also great compassion, that we drop the story of whatever it is that we're caught up in, and recognize that it's always okay to feel what we feel. The important thing is, are we going to examine it, step back from it, and use it to carry us further? So those are my thoughts on this topic at the moment. And I think we'll take some time to meditate. And then I want to hear, and I'd love to talk about like the real challenges that we face on a day-to-day level. And all of us do. I mean, you might think, oh yeah, when people are in monastic life, maybe they don't have these problems, or maybe even after years, we see people go through these periods of dryness, or periods of working with something that arises out of the past. We don't know what we'll face as we go along. We got to have our tools ready, sharpened. Okay, so let's sit a bit. Let's find a comfortable position. Take a few deep breaths. It's helpful to first check in with the body. And invite it to relax. With our attention on our breathing, we can actually feel into the whole body. We can notice areas that are tight, areas that might have some discomfort. And we can bring some thoughts of kindness to those areas. And see if just by suggesting it, we can see those areas soften. Or if you feel tightness in a spot, like maybe your calf or your shoulder or your neck, if you can't, if it's not relaxing in a natural way, you can tighten that area. If you tighten it and then release, sometimes that helps it let go. And then we can ask, does that same method work for the mind? Or we can ask, what would the method be that would work for the mind? If the mind is tight, if the mind is tense, if the mind is agitated, restless, sad, dejected, afraid. Bringing kindness and acceptance to the reality of where it is in this moment can really help. Setting all thoughts aside of how it should be or how I should be. And just feeling the way it actually is. Mindfulness and kindness engaged. And of course, sometimes the mind is joyful, happy, contented, peaceful. And then, as the Buddha says, you can just abide happily meditating, letting the process take its own course, unfolding as you go deeper into stillness. But if that is not the case, noticing where that clinging might be, where that idea of self is arising. And inviting the determination to free the mind, to care for the mind, to train the mind. Knowing that as we observe the ways of the mind, the habit patterns, the tendencies that we're learning about ourselves, and we're learning how to apply the Dhamma in a way that works for this particular mental state. Bringing to mind a snippet of the Dhamma that applies. Like when we're worried about our health, remembering that having changes in our health is natural, normal, inevitable. That this is something that happens to everyone. Setting aside the thoughts of why me? Why now? These kinds of things are always possible to ask, but meaningless. That's the kind of thought that comes up normally in human beings that don't have the Dhamma to their access. So we set that aside. Remind ourselves, yeah, this body isn't mine. It never was mine. I only take care of it. And I have this opportunity to use it for awakening. What a beautiful thing. We can invite the gratitude for all the things that are right, that are helpful, that aren't going wrong. Maybe even thinking of it as going wrong is a barrier to happiness. Contentment in the face of changing conditions. So really noticing how what we say has an effect on how we feel. What we say, what we think. And training the mind to seek out the truth. Can we come to a point of appreciating the difficulties as much as we appreciate those things that are easy? That if I really work with this habit I have that brings me into a negative mental state and I overcome it, I learn how to work through it. What an amazing achievement that is. What an amazing source of empowerment on this path. When our mind is experiencing a negative mental state, particularly sadness or fear, then to remember that this is normal for human beings. It's nothing wrong. It's completely understandable. We can bring kindness and understanding to that experience first and foremost, and then encouragement. Letting go little by little of that misunderstanding of what we are and what we have and what we need. So, what do you think? How do you work with negative mental states? Anybody here have anything they want to say? You're also welcome. Do you ever get to the place where you think, I shouldn't be feeling this way? I've been practicing the Dhamma a long time. Yeah.
I was out walking this morning and noticing how the seasons have shifted now.
Mhm.
And I'm so relieved that the heat is gone, and this sadness comes over me of things passing, of like it's this beautiful morning, and I feel melancholy and sadness, and I kept thinking like I I should be just noticing these trees and the sounds, and yet I kept getting caught up in sadness and uh, and worry over my daughter who is struggling with addiction, and I feel like should I what do I do with this? What do I it seems so present, uh, and I at one hand I wanted to push it away. On the other hand, it felt like, oh, this is just being in touch with, because I kept thinking like, I have everything I need to be happy, but I don't really want to be happy right now. Being happy seems almost, that's not what the world is bringing to me. It's not happiness, is sorrow, and I'm just, I guess I just want to know what your reflections are on that. How do I work with that?
Yeah. Well, knowing you a little bit, I'm confident that you're already, and obviously by your description, you're already paying attention to it. And it feels like with quite a dose of kindness and understanding.
Hmm.
So I think that's an important first step. And seeing the cause, why you feel the way you feel, and how understandable it is in human life. Because yeah, inevitably people we love are going to be experiencing things or doing things that are not what we would wish for them. And also things are falling apart left and right all around us. It's the nature of this world. But then how do we re-establish our mind in the Dhamma? Do we show up on Saturday morning? That's a good good way. Be with friends. The Buddha said so many times, the way to think about these things is to recognize that this is the nature of human life, of life as a living being in any realm. And that the Dhamma, the wisdom of the Dhamma, leads us back to that kind of spiritual abiding. You know, the equanimity that is called for when we, you know, we're observing the challenges that those people we care about are experiencing, knowing that they have their own path, they have their own karma. And, you know, holding in mind the blessings that we have for them, you know, the care, the wish for their well-being. And like I've often said, the thing that got me through raising teenagers was saying it's just a phase. This is a phase. So one of the very useful ways of working with crises, if you want to call them that, in our lives, is to step back and see the much bigger picture. So when a mother would come to the Buddha after her baby dies, he would talk about the bigger picture. How many times you've lost a baby. How many times you've lost someone. This is the nature. It keeps going again and again. There's going to be another phase for your daughter. In this life, in the next life. And all the love that you give her, the understanding and the compassion, helps in the conditioning for that to be a better phase. Whenever you can remind her of her goodness. That helps in the conditioning for a better phase. And we have to do that for ourselves. Yeah, I'm growing old. I'm going to die. And if I haven't realized Nibbana by then, I'm going to get reborn somewhere. And if I can do good for someone else, and I can put my attention on Dhamma, then there's an upward progress. And it may feel like it's not, you know, a straight upward trajectory, because we have these dips and low points. But overall it is, because of our determination, the inclination of the heart, sloping and slanting towards Nibbana, like the Ganges sloping and slanting toward the ocean. So where's the relief? And the relief is in letting go. You know, we are not in charge.
Right. Right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Ron and Serena.
Thank you for your reflections. You mentioned towards the beginning, I think, self-view. For me, self-view is the problem, not the answer.
Well, yeah, definitely.
So for me, when things are arising that are negative in my mind, I am interested in the relinquishment of self-view.
Yeah.
Which my understanding is that stream entry, which was accomplished by many lay people back in the Buddhist time, an aim, a worthy, wholesome aim, stream entry, is to relinquish self-view, the first fetter, correct? The first fetter?
Well, it is, and it is the aim, and and it isn't in a way also, because that relinquishment of self, it is the aim, and the actual relinquishment of it doesn't just come by deciding, as you well know. It comes sometimes as the unexpected result of the practice. So the Buddha gave the sequence of things that we need to practice in order to, you might say, put in the causes and conditions that stream entry experience will happen. And it isn't a direct, like, I want to just drop self-view. It's associating with people who are awake, and it's listening to the Dhamma, and it's practicing the Noble Eightfold Path. None of those 8 factors is, I'm going to drop self-view. So it's like, how does it happen? It's almost like magical, right? But there is that encouragement to constantly reflect on those 3 characteristics. And in that, reminding ourselves, wait a minute, this isn't mine. This isn't me. Yeah, something, happens to the body, and that's a normal, natural thing. Either an accident or some part wears out. It's no different than your car in a way. The car gets completely crumpled over there at Steve's house, and and the body can have the same experience. And if we remind ourselves of that, instead of kind of going through life in a cavalier way of thinking, I'm going to be this strong and this sound and this capable forever. We don't really say those things because we know better, but we think that way. Mm-hmm. If we keep reminding ourselves, and I think that's what you're saying, we got to keep reminding ourselves, this is not me, this is not mine. And then those fetters fall away. Yeah, the experience of realizing or seeing the Dhamma in stream entry, it's not like when that's going to happen. It just happens. It happens when the karmic conditions are lined up. But it's important that we have the trust that it will happen. And not think, oh, it's way in the future. I'm such a pathetic practitioner. That also comes from self-view. And Ron, you're totally correct, Ron. The problem always comes back to me and mine. I'm thinking this is me and mine. And that's the misunderstanding. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, well, I guess one thing I can appreciate the years of teaching that I've heard and practice I've done in the way I didn't get attached to the automobile or the too worked up, but there's I've got this attraction to problem solving that's a kind of a hindrance to meditation. I guess I don't know if it's a restlessness or actually a form of sense pleasure or something, a mental sense pleasure. But I say, oh, okay, not now. We deal with that later. But what about not now? And kind of keep spinning through that cycle. So. Yeah, I don't know if there's a question in this, but it's just kind of That's
Yeah.
kind of,
Yeah. So I'll ask you a question. When has that slowed down in your experience?
well, I think coming back, watching the breath and kind of getting back in touch with the breath and the body and seeing where it is internally, you know, gives it some break, and then it, but it's not a permanent thing, but it,
Yeah. Yeah. I think in terms of like, to what degree, and if I think the more you can take time to come back to the breath and the body, so even meditating many times through the day, maybe,
yeah.
as the mind is, it's a kind of a cumulative thing. If you spend more time with that kind of focus, you can even focus, you can do formal meditation, but even informally, when you're doing other things that you don't have to be so engaged in mentally, then you can actually, repeat a phrase or do, or really pay attention to your breathing. And you can see it, how that kind of builds up an energy that then helps the mind have more relief. Because it's like you said, sometimes it's just that there's an agitation, and then the mind is just looking for something to place it on.
Yeah.
And it feels like problem solving. I have to think about this. I have to make this happen, or I have to get this done. Sometimes it is that we're really busy, and we kind of got this big stack of things we have to work through.
Yeah.
But it's some combination of those two. And we really do need time for the mind to be peaceful and to really kind of revel in that.
Yeah.
Enjoy it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an indication that we need more time that's really peaceful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Neil?
Yeah. How's the buzz? Is there still a buzz sound?
It's a little bit, but not too bad. You're fine.
Okay. Yeah, in terms of difficult mental states, something that I heard in a talk at a retreat is something that's been very helpful for me. I used to suffer from really debilitating panic attacks. And I had one during this particular retreat, and the teacher had just talked about this phrase, make space for it. And I think of that in connection to what you were talking about earlier. A couple of times you mentioned how you don't push something away, you turn and face it. And I had this panic attack while eating my lunch at this retreat, and I ran outside because I didn't want to see anyone. I didn't want to have anyone see me lay down on the ground, which is usually my first response when it would happen. And then I remembered, she said, make space for it. And I had that, I took a deep breath, and instead of trying to, no, don't do this, and it literally lifted out of my body.
Wow, that's great.
And it's still a technique that I use for, it's funny, where I most often use it now. I've started getting frequent Charlie horses in my leg. and I'm sitting and suddenly my leg wants to cramp up. And my initial reaction is, what is this? I'm out of control of my body. How do I make this stop?
Yeah.
And now I just take a breath and say, all right, let's just let it do its thing. And it just moves through and is gone.
Yes.
I can't say it works for everything because I don't always remember to
Yeah.
use it, but I found it very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Yes, exactly. I like that phrase, make space for it. You know, did you ever read this poem by Rumi called The Guest House? Yeah, some people know. I don't have it handy, but it's that same idea. Whatever comes, welcome it in. That's the first step. And really, yeah, if you make space for it, it's not at all like indulging in it or encouraging it. You know, you can really feel the difference. You're just allowing it, you know, and being.
It's like, of course, I have to think of the Beatles and Paul McCartney. It's
Sure.
basically let it be.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the what I notice more and more in myself too is the kindness that's there when we let it be, when we make space for it. You know, there's an aspect of the mind that you are developing where the Dhamma is foremost, and mindfulness and kindness are really established. And that's the part we continue to encourage, to grow, and be present for whatever else is going on. And you know, it's like Neil said, we often forget, or we may forget, less and less often, hopefully, to really just open up to that. We make space and we see it for what it is. Yes.
This is actually bringing up a question for me. And I'm realizing I can use this for emotional states and even physical states. But it now occurs to me, what about with thoughts? Because that's my biggest problem with meditation is I just keep going off
Mm-hmm.
on those, you know, that monkey mind, like was in the poem, in the Taragata thing. And it's like if you, I've never tried it, but a technique of saying, well, just sort of make room for them, I'll just be off, you know.
I don't think so.
Is there some way to adapt that to
Um,
meditation?
Well, I don't think so. And this is it's a very good question. And the Buddha definitely talked about the approach to thoughts as very different from the approach to feeling. And thoughts, he said, you don't tolerate thoughts of greed and hatred. You don't tolerate thoughts of cruelty and lust. He said, you cut them off. You think what you want to think when you want to think it. So if a thought arises I had someone who said to me once, I had this horrible, horrible thought, and I didn't even know it was possible for me to think such a thing. And he was really shaken up about it. And I said, you gotta just think of thought as something that just comes out of the past. It's just about the past. Mm-hmm. It's the only place it can come from. Well, almost only. I have been around very, very, very developed practitioners who I know are planting things in my mind. Good things, only really good things. But in general, our thoughts are just coming from the past. And they're not to be respected necessarily. It's not the same thing as making space for the mental state. Now, this is where we start to see the real distinction between a mental state and the content or the formations that flow through the mind. So mental states are related to feeling and emotion. You have a mental tone. It has more to do with our feeling, our emotion. We can have a state of melancholy, as was mentioned earlier, or a state of, delight. Not necessarily delighting in any particular thing. Doesn't have to be sense pleasure. You're just happy. So it's not the same. You don't make this. So this is where I think sometimes we go wrong with this idea of just open awareness. Because then people have a tendency to just let the mind do whatever it does. And it may not be taking you in a good direction. And it's like Talaputta, it's, hey, mind, you were the one who wanted me to become a monk. Now, why aren't you meditating? Why aren't you happy with this now? Anyhow, you get the idea. It's like the thoughts we need to have. That's what we train the mind. That's how we train the mind. Now, I think what you're wondering about does have some significance in that we don't want to be harsh with the mind. It's not like clamping down on it, at least maybe only as a last resort, like you see in the Removal of Distracting Thoughts Sutta. Is that number 20, 19 or 20 in the Majjhima Nikaya? I think it's, yeah. Pressing your tongue to the roof of your mouth and clenching your teeth and pressing mind down with mind. Yeah, not usually the best approach. But he gives those 4 other methods first. But the Buddha is definitely making a distinction between how we deal with our mental states, how we deal with our feelings, and how we deal with thought. You tune the radio, you don't have to listen to the station, all the stations that go by. Yeah. Thank you, Neil. Carol?
Oh, just a quick question. You read from a sutta earlier, and I wrote down the number 22.90, but I didn't write down I thought it was the Anguttara Nikaya, but I wasn't sure.
No, it's the Samyutta.
The Samyutta.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yes, I won't be at Satish Island, unfortunately, so I do need to read the rest of what this Chula is doing.
You bet. And we will talk, Shana, yeah, we will talk about we'll talk about that teaching at some point. I think during the retreat, I want to have at least a couple sessions where we talk about those teachings that bring about enlightenment, that have really, like at the end of it, the person is like free, or deeply changed, and just take a look at those, what's in those. Of course, they have to land at the right time, and we have to do the work to build up to it. But yeah, thank you, Carol. And if you have questions about that teaching, you let me know, okay?
Will do. Thank you.
You're welcome.